Um, Somehow I've lost all of my hosting privileges. Um, and so,
Oh,
hi everybody. Welcome to our second and final keynote at Generation Analog 2024. I hope you've all been staying analog. I know I have. And I'm really, really, really excited and delighted and honored to introduce Dr. M. Friedman, who is an associate professor at Auburn University. Her work draws parallels between cultural production in the 18th century and today. And cultural production is kind of a book history term. It's very much signaling all the sort of things that we understand in our culture and where they come from, the materialities of that, where they come from, right? Like be it books, VHS tapes, or tabletop role-playing games, which is why M's work is so spectacularly connecting all these things together. She has two books coming out. The first is her monograph. It's a history of actual play online. And the second is kind of done with a collective. It's really interesting from all the rumors I've been hearing of it. It's a multi-authored critical companion to Dimension 20. So really, really exciting. You also might be familiar with M's work from many of her excellent essays at Polygon, where they're all available for free online, and you can check them out. She's written in a really accessible tone. They're exciting, and I always see people like tweeting and sharing them online when they come out. Um, but apart from all these wonderful professional accolades, I want to speak sentimentally here because since the very first generation analog, M has spent all of her time without any kind of prompting or coaxing from us, live tweeting our panels and doing a lot of unattributed work behind the scenes. I see her work as that which has kind of grown up and around Generation Analog, and so it's very much a product of our community. Um, the notes that she writes about in her work aren't just about what culture is, but also so much they are about the possibilities of what culture could be and what is hopefully to come. I can't wait for a book to come out next year, and I think it's going to be a landmark title in the analog games canon. So, with that, we welcome M. Friedman. Please take it away.
oh boy, can't live up to that at all. Good Lord. But we're gonna try. Hi guys. Woo, what am I sharing? What am I sharing? There we go. Um, Hi everyone. Hello from my home office in central Alabama, which sits on the traditional lands of the Muskogee Creek. As it's important to acknowledge from the outset, I sit here and work at a land grant college in no small part due to the most infamous example of a displacement of a people from their home. First by treaty, then by fraud, harassment, violence, and ultimately forced removal. As we've said more than enough times today, and we'll say again, home is a fraught subject. And that's the subject of my talk today. And as Aaron has noted, until very recently, all of my research labor in game studies has taken place at home, indeed, often between these four walls. Like analog game studies itself, I have found the remote to be a constraint that has also served as an affordance, as I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. I feel so lucky to have been a lurker here for the last several years and to recognize so many names on the program and in chat thanks to the virtual communities, however shaking and threatened, we've crafted together. And I do not remember the first time I watched or listened to actual play, but I can say with some certainty that it was prior to the rollout of the fifth edition of Dungeons and Dragons a decade ago. I do remember the first time I wrote about it, which was in response to a call for papers issued in 2018. I'm so glad that this is Jen Gruling's first generation analog. In 2021, I taught my first course on TTRPG and actual play, versions of which I've taught on an annual basis ever since. And over the last several years, in response to the exigencies of the COVID-19 pandemic, uh, killing basically all of my other projects, I've become immersed in actual play and the communities of practice that make it. And so, my talk today, my friends, is in the spirit of being an 18th centuryist, a long and winding and meandering road here. Um, It's going to be a set of knotty problems rather than a polished argument, with a series of observations that I currently grapple with as I try to better understand what actual play was for its audience and its makers, how that is changing as new participants enter the field, and how all of this relates to the broader world of tabletop role-playing games and new media ecologies. And to give you a sense, as of today, I've conducted two IRB approved surveys in 23 and 24, each with several thousand responses. In addition, I've done equally cleared academic interviews with over a dozen participants around the world, with dozens more in preparation. And as part of my work in Polygon in the classroom, I've talked to dozens more folks informally. And of course, as a public intellectual and what some refer to as a micro influencer, I come into conversation with still greater numbers of members of the TTRPG and actual play fields. Many I call colleagues, others collaborators, and a few friends. Where I quote directly from people, just so you know, they have generally consented or it's their public utterances. Um, and so I just wanted to gesture at the beginning to both my research methods, which are wide ranging, as well as some of the outputs that looks like. The book is going to be a little bit longer in the pipeline, but it is in active progress. But first, I want to talk about how in 2012 Matthew Mercer got my character killed. That week, the popular D&D actual play Dimension 20 had its first ever total party kill, an event so striking that Dropout had sent me a screener far earlier than typical, offering as well to coordinate an interview with DM Brennan Lee Mulligan for Polygon. As part of the write-up, I asked other DMs of my acquaintance about their experience with TPKs in their home games and in performed play. The phenomenon was rare by all accounts, both because of the nature of D&D resurrection magic and the sense that there's a risk of a TPK being massively unfulfilling. And when I asked DM Matthew Mercer, who had faced a near TPK on stream earlier that year, about the phenomenon, he instead reached back to his home game, where, as he says, the party abandoned focus on on opponents and instead divided their attention. Here is his full kind of description here. The salient point is that the ranger grabbed the rogue and forced her to flee, allowing for the campaign to continue, making a near TPK rather than a total party wipe. Days later, I found myself at my own home game looking at the scenario you see on screen. We too had been ambushed and had been forced to divide our attention between opponents. Almost all of us were dead, dying, or unconscious, and I, the cleric at far right, not my mini wasn't even completely painted yet, had no more spells left. It was then that I recalled Mercer's story of his home game and turned and tried to run, hoping I too would be able to successfully flee, regroup, and convince my dungeon master to allow for a recovery mission. I was not so lucky. I was overtaken and killed, although I did save the animal companions. I think about this moment often, in part because it stands as a notable point along the path where my scholarship moved increasingly from detached observer to observed observer on the way to becoming a fully implicated and embedded subject. But more importantly for our purposes today, I bring it up to note that it is the influence of the anecdote of a home game, rather than the thousands of hours of live stream Critical Role gameplay, that has ever had a meaningful impact on my own play at home. It is, in fact, to date, the only specific and concrete example I have been provided of Mercer altering someone's home play by his influence. I have a bounty out on that, just so you know. Even so, Critical Role and by extension actual plays as a form have been haunted by the idea that they are transforming the nature of home play. Enter Quentin Smith.
If you will allow me one slightly loose analogy in this video, actual play is to role-playing as pornography is to sex. Actual play is a slick entertainment product performed by professionals that has the contradictory properties of making some people feel bad about how they do the thing while not being as fun as doing the thing yourself amateurishly, no matter what your level of experience.
So, as we can see in this 2022 introduction to how to get into tabletop RPGs for his former channel Shut Up and Sit Down, Smith addresses an imagined audience of potential players and GMs simultaneously intrigued and intimidated by actual plays. He delivers this shot over the animation done for the opening of Critical Role's third campaign, which features rotoscoped animation of the players, literally made cartoons on screen. This is by way of nodding to the Mercer effect that posits that Matt Mercer has had a negative effect by creating an impossibly high standard. And the use of the opening sequence that is animated reinforces the argument that what he and his players do on screen is unreal, a fantasy. And Smith's analogy is not new. It appeared on Twitter in 2017 and 2019, and these are just the most salient examples, and with regularity ever since. I've seen it on social media. I've heard it among groups of academics and designers. Reddit discussions hand wring over the potential impact of actual play on imagined tables. Like many ideas in TTRPG, is evergreen precisely because it is a renewable source of hot takes. But I want to be clear from the start that I object to the analogy not because it is louche or negative, but because it is cheap and careless, and functionally never invoked by anyone with familiarity with either recorded sex work or recorded role playing games. And so, while there are interesting and sophisticated parallels to be drawn, the use of this analogy in practice is to foreclose all discussion. Or, let me give someone else a chance to speak.
We had a 45-minute conversation about that fucking gas. And then we started talking about whether actual play is porn, and that is beyond the scope of today's conversation.
No, it's not. No.
Now I want to talk about that part. I applied for a grant so that I can come and we can have this conversation, Abria.
No, if actual play is porn, then it's like, is any kind of performance porn?
No, that is literally what my argument was. It was like, it doesn't work that way. No.
No, we leave. You can see almost all the scaffolding. I mean, like, if cutting the ums out of a scene makes it porn, I think the definition's gotten out of hand.
I apologize for the audio not coming through Zoom, and so I'm going to cut that off. And just note that the argument here among the Worlds Beyond Number folks is that the analogy to porn that Quentin Smith suggests in his piece is refuted by the Worlds Beyond Number folks by the idea that is all performance pornography. Although, as Erika Ishii also notes, they are behind a paywall. It is worth noting that the origins of performed play online are intertwined with sex work. For many reasons, including a desire to not be sued, historians and critics do not frequently discuss I Hit It With My Axe, an actual play produced by Escapist magazine in 2010 that was among the first actual plays to receive mainstream attention, largely due to the number of adult entertainers among the cast. Recorded in a domestic space, Alex Chalk has noted the ways in which the show intentionally leans into aesthetics of amateur and casual, which Slate reporter Carrie Howley interpreted as both reality show and definitely boring, but in a relaxing way, though speculating that, or they're noting that the speculation in the comments section suggested it was an advertisement for the other services of the players. And if you'll allow me a brief digression back into my home field of 18th century studies, as my friend and colleague Kathy Luby elegantly argues in What Pornography Knows, her multi-century examination of how and what pornography communicates, it is in fact a misunderstanding of genre altogether to believe any single thing can define it, or that it can be defined by an effect on some abstract reader. It is, in fact, in this sense that we can put pornography and actual play together as genres that consistently elude self-contained singular understandings of production or impact. We can fall into the error of assuming that actual play is produced or consumed for a narrow band of reasons, but we'll miss a whole lot. And my brothers, my sisters, my friends beyond the binary, we have done this too. In fact, studies of actual play have suffered to date from their own version of the Mercer effect, or what we might more accurately call the McElroy Mercer Mulligan effect. In order to scope work on actual play, which historically has long running times and extended campaigns, projects that focus on actual play tend to focus on the most popular shows. And we can see this in highlighting the Adventure Zone is in yellow, Critical Role is in blue, a combination is in green, for both role-playing games in the digital age as well as Watch Us Roll, which we see overemphasize two of the most popular D&D focused actual plays. And in the forthcoming dossier on actual play edited by myself and Maria Alberto for the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, we're no better. The shift has moved on, however, towards the anthology series Dimension 20, which inspired the book that we are collectively working on. It's also worth noting from the top that we have failed to critically examine much of the work of creating actual plays that don't play D&D. And so while there has been thoughtful work by many that attempt to get past this challenge of scale by zooming back and attending to labors of labor and production, few scholars have the time and freedom to more fully engage with the wide swath of a rapidly proliferating form. Last year, over 21,000 Twitch channels streamed using the Dungeons and Dragons tag, and over 10,000 under the tabletop role-playing games tag. And as Maria and I have discovered over the last several years while supervising the crowdsourced bibliography Crit Roll Bib, an enormous amount of the actual play scholarship is done by early career researchers, including undergraduates like my own Olivia Price, Carson Barnes, and Cole Anderson. The structural iniquities of academia and time constraints combined with the fragility and marginality of digital text, as will surprise no one who can hear me. And so the other thing that I want to signal in my remarks today is to note the ways in which our understanding of the form of actual play transforms significantly when we take into account the scope of what I call the ambitious middle, the increasingly self-defined cohort of actual play creators with a suite of different kinds of artistic and professional goals, carving out recognition and funding in a host of ways. It is the ambitious middle, a product of the 2020s, that has largely superintended and participated in crafting the early elements of what Bourdieu noted as the signifiers of a maturing field of cultural production, especially awards. And while these have had debatable levels of success in differentiating themselves from capital and its enumerative logics, the activity is nevertheless present. And as I discussed elsewhere, this activity is generally characterized as distinct from the work of an imagined superior category, largely undefined. You can see here it's called large scale and union productions, but infallibly includes Critical Role and Dimension 20 as outliers rather than community members. And it's worth noting that this is a notable shift from the pre-2020 sense of actual play production, when for a variety of reasons beyond the scope of today, it's worth noting that many more creators of a variety of budgets and formats could literally find themselves in community. Let's be clear. Actual play can be pedagogic, parasocial, entertaining, dull, pandering, insular, masturbatory, commercial, crude, polished, rough, comic, dramatic, operatic, melodramatic, sophisticated, and much more. It's produced under a variety of conditions by many different players that bring wide ranges of skills, experiences, and expectations to the table. And so I want to talk and think seriously about what we mean when we say actual play is uniquely separate and distinct from a home game, especially given how many of the earlier practitioners of the form, including the ones we study most often, insist that their style of play does not meaningfully vary between recorded and home play. When asked, Matt Mercer says there's not that much different in his prep. It might not be best for a show, but he doesn't tailor to the format. A line he consistently hews to then and now. This has been reaffirmed by his own former production colleagues like Eddie Doty, who has said for at least the 30 some odd episodes where he was present, it was more or less the same as their home game. And while the actual play is now the center of a much larger apparatus that combines work and play into a transmedia phenomenon, cast member Sam Riegel, as recently as 2 weeks ago, has noted that the cast owners see their recording sessions as, quote, holy time. dedicated to being together in play outside of the demands of their increasingly vast audience. This talk is thus energized by a thought experiment that I first proposed to Matt. What if we believe Matthew Mercer and other actual players who insist that their playstyle is not meaningfully different across different contexts? And as Aaron has mentioned, you let a strange creature into your midst. So I'm throwing all of the spaghetti at the wall here, including some elements from my book history training. But first, I want to think about what is a home game. As far as I can tell, we don't typically define what it is. Home group, as Nick Meiser noted yesterday, is the unmarked category. Although I'm going to quibble later about the extent to which home games remain in the Latourian center of calculation for a new generation of actual play creators. In discussions of actual play, home game often serves not as a precise term, but as an umbrella term that means not recorded or without an audience beyond the table. And it's worth reiterating the obvious and what Meiser and White reiterated yesterday. The resultant binary between home game and actual play leaves out a great deal. Organized play at game stores and conventions are intimate and ephemeral in ways that home games are, but are public in an equally number of complex ways. I also argue elsewhere that convention play and camps like Wayfinder are the foundation of the training of the best dungeon masters in performance for that very reason. Conversely, it's also important to remember that home games are important sites of labor in TTRPG. Playtesting often occurs with home groups as new games move through development. And as Evan Turner reminds us, the original meaning for the term actual play is of recorded game sessions for the purposes of iteration and analysis along with record keeping. And they, as Evan says, are just as fraught with questions of status and framing as recordings later created for entertainment. And this talk is just indebted to Evan all over the place because he also reminded me of Melanie Swalwell's definition of homebrew from her work on early computing in the late 1970s through the mid 1980s. And as Austin Anderson discussed at the start of our conference, TTRPG's own ideas of homebrew are intimately rooted to this electronic practice and has been used since the early days of D&D. So I think it's worth doing a little bit of comparison. Swalwell's notion of homebrew in computing is made in domestic space, and indeed, much of the actual play, including some of the big names, are recorded in domestic spaces. It's worth noting how many studios are basements and garages rebuilt for purpose. Largely self-taught, I think is still fair to say of much of the creators of actual play. And while Swalwell's notion of homebrew is solo creators, and actual play almost by definition has very few such examples, it is worth noting that a single player or game master often assumes all of the production labor for many actual plays. And it's also really hard to talk about what scale means in a comparative way between the late 70s and 80s and the 2020s, given the nature of podcatchers and platforms like Twitch and YouTube. It is worth noting the ways in which scale is constrained in many ways for a variety of reasons. And finally, I think experimental ethic is a really interesting hallmark that I do see kind of running like ribbons through actual play, and it is not neatly tied to one budgetary level. In other words, a modest production can be equally likely to play it safe as they are to experiment, and higher budget productions are locked into particular audience expectations, but often rooted in their early experimentation, and they continue to be in a state of constant iteration in order to appeal to new audiences. So here's challenge number one. How far from home has actual play actually moved? And the answer that many people give me is that the presence of an audience or the act of recording is what transforms the experience. Again, to quote from Evan's work on The Forge, actual play is mediated, and the act of deciding to transform TTRPG into some kind of actual play will affect the actual play itself. And this is something that he uses both in reference to entertainment-based recordings as well as analytical recordings. And I think about that a lot when I kind of go through my dream interlude. Um, when I imagine testing a hypothesis by observing a group of players who both have played in performance and then watching them play at home. And ideally, what would occur is that we'd be able to observe if there's any meaningful differences, note that word meaning, between the two play experiences. But as Evan notes, even the act of domestic observation is itself a transformation. And with academic best practices in play, it's almost impossible not to disclose to a group of players that they are being observed and for what purpose, which, throws it all to hell as well. But we do have at least one example of players who have both offline and recorded play experiences who have discussed that experience. Welcome back, Quentin Smith. Only this time it's Quentin Smith of 2024, a man who has joined us in the realm of TTRPG. This year, he has experimented with actual play as part of his new shift to reviewing tabletop role-playing games after his decade of board game reviewing. And in the debrief for his one shot, he asked his players who are having their first experience along with him with actual play. Rob Morgan, who you see at far right, is one of the players in Smith's home games, and he was the first to pipe up, noting that you're just being filmed having fun rather than doing some kind of performance. And Smith says that he agrees, quote, after a certain point, it's actually play. But like I never had a speech to start a session written down. And so we now have a more nuanced understanding of actual play, which includes some shifts in play style at the top, including a prepared opening speech, which had to be recorded twice and spliced in editing. Player Gareth Damian Martin then indicates it was that moment of introduction where Smith addressed the camera that he recalled, oh God, we're doing actual play. Because Smith was doing, quote, not what you do at the table. You were narrating for the benefit of the audience. Martin notes that this experience was not like theatrical improv, but that the second voice of the player playing allowed for moments of reflection on play that relieved performance anxiety. Smith then adds that the actual thing that he was expected to have prepared was exhausted and he felt very exposed. But ultimately, as he thinks out loud, he says, it's just peculiar. It's the same, but different. And what we see in the Citizen Sleeper debrief is that the players could identify some elements that were not what they do at home, but that the majority of the play experience was actually play, quote, being filmed having fun. This was somewhat less the case for Smith as GM by virtue of the responsibility that comes with leading, which I think is also true at home, but more discussion here. I thought about this a lot when I visited Dropout and sat in the DM's chair in Dimension 20's dome. Soon as I looked up, there's a camera pointing directly at me at center in my field of vision. And this is common for just about every other actual play studio configuration I've seen, from the high-tech setup of Critical Role to the more modest setup of Atlanta's Do You Validate? But what is equally common is the comparative unobtrusiveness of the cameras intended to capture the players. In the dome, two cameras flank the table at angles. There's only one because this is not an active recording at the moment. But the player's gaze is oriented to look to the left and right of camera, either to the GM or to their fellow players. This is also true at Critical Role, where you almost can't see the cameras because of the nature of the lighting. And at Pixel Circus, where you can't see the cameras in this shot because the players playing are actively obscuring our view, and beyond. And so recording equipment is a tricky reality of recorded play, but I want to note that that first of all, in these kinds of highly artificial studio actual plays, there's ways in which this melts into the background. And of course, the majority of actual plays are played remotely, often using the same apparatus that we're using to access this conference and that many use to play what they and I would call our home games. During my research, I've participated in several remote actual plays, both live streamed and pre-recorded. And in 2020, all 3 of my home games went online, and 2 remain there to this day. As I speak, I have a rather substantial microphone just out of frame, which hovers near my keyboard. I forget its existence frequently, as I do the small web camera that in theory I look up to on a regular basis. Hi. When I am aware of them, they do not inherently carry with them singular connotations of professionalism or performance after years of acclimatization via board game arena brunches and writing accountability groups. I don't have good answers here, but I want to investigate further in my work the ways in which states of flow during play might allow us to become forgetful of such material elements of our play experience during recorded play. But I want to flip this for a moment to the audience while we're still thinking a little bit about Citizen Sleeper. This is a recent comment on that debrief video. The saddest part about this is that I would love to have this experience at the table, but I know I'll never be able to GM as well as Quinn's, and I won't be able to draw this out of my players, no matter what system I'm using. Lovely to watch, though. In other words, witnessing a reasonably experienced GM playing with his non-professional, non-actor friends was enough to trigger what we might call the Quinn's effect. The sense that what was being witnessed was beyond the reach of the viewer. This, despite Smith's pedagogic investment in demystifying and welcoming new players. I think this viewer comment also provides some nuance to the table side aesthetic D.A. Hall discussed yesterday morning. It takes far less than we imagine for gameplay to feel out of reach for some viewers. While we have talked about sprezzatura on Discord, it's not in terms of artifice, but internalized training, ones that audiences sometimes catch up on. This is another set of puzzle pieces. And so I want to add another, building on that discussion from D.A. Hall. Hi, Nicholas Orvis, who's not actually live, but we'll see this later, who asks, why not just play the game in private if you insist that this is exactly like your home game? And so in my final minutes, I want to talk about why we record. So very briefly, some reasons that we've discussed during our time together in this conference has been the OG notion of actual play as preservation or analytical tool, the crass commercial reasons of content creation, of income streams for professionals in other fields, to sell products related to TTRPGs or the games themselves, and the kind of latent we're on Zoom Discord, might as well push record. And so in these final minutes, I want to mention some reasons to record play that I've been told by practitioners in interviews that have not been mentioned to date. And I'm going to go through those. This is like the brief overview, but for the purposes of moving it along, I'm going to go right to their cool slides. First, actual play as committed play, as scheduled play. And this is true at every price point, at every monetization level or not. Worlds Beyond Number, I can tell you with some authority now, everyone has a hard time getting a hold of Booked and Busy and a little bit Object Permanence Challenge, Abria Iyengar. I love you very much. But a woman who keeps her commitments. And so making this actual play into a professional commitment with an LLC is a way of ensuring that camp gets priority when those meetings get scheduled. Second, actual play, we haven't talked about this, although it has come up just a little bit to date in Emily Kugler's talk and elsewhere, but actual play for many creators is a liberatory art form where they can do things that cannot be done in other spaces. And this is true for professionals as well as amateurs. And I just want to highlight Kolak again. I'm happy to always talk about Kolak. But also Gudia, which has been making the web festival circuit, a Desi-inspired running of Bluebeard's Bride that is remarkably innovative in being an all non-femme identified cast. And you can watch right now God Killer Last Hope and the other works of Transplanar, which attempt to use TTRPGs to imagine all kinds of spectra of queer possibilities, from queer rage to trans joy to monstrosity in all its naked red and tooth and claw. Some of the things that we haven't talked about at all, even by oblique mention, is that actual play is a worldwide phenomenon and a multilingual phenomenon, and one that in many communities is a place where the very notion of gaming becomes real for different people of different identities. In the case of Safaya, who you see here, she is organizing in Saudi Arabia gaming communities both offline, where they can be mixed in public, as well as online home actual plays that make female gamers more visible in the Middle Eastern context. And finally, and most surprising, and this is where my book starts, I have been told that actual play is part of creating a national literature. And this is an idea that I am indebted to Marichka Panfirova for. Marichka and her sister are based in Kyiv, where they began recording their actual play right before the Russian invasion in 2022. In fact, much of their recording and editing took place while they were actively displaced. And there is so much more to say about this. But when I asked the reasons why actual play meant something to her and was an important part of her energies during such an important and stressful time, that's what came up. So there's more to say. There's more to say about accidents and substantives and things like that. But I just want to kind of gesture to some things that people have said to me that are unique to actual play that also can appear at home. Which is to say, planning out of sight of playtime, pacing to fit time constraints, agreed upon story beats, scripted content. It's a signature of NPCs and LARP. Elaborate battle maps and miniatures and cosplay we see in home games all over the place, including the longest running of such games, the infamous The Game, that is older almost than I am. And I want to put up this slide near the end. Feel free to screenshot it for our discussion, for some differences that might matter and might not. And I'm using the language from W.W. Gregg's 1951 article on rationale of the copy text to talk about accidentals, things that don't have an impact on meaning, and substantives, things that do change the meaning of a work. And here I've split it into for players and for audience. I don't know that bathroom breaks change the meaning of an actual play. I don't know that I need to have that dead air. But re-recording of player speech may be a significant change, at least on the player side, if not for the audience. And extensive editing can be a substantive transformation in different kinds of ways. And so I wanted to talk about the actual differences in actual play as at this moment. It can be overdetermined. It does feature a narrow band of play styles. The theater kids have taken over the form in a significant way. And this is in part tied to a narrow band of systems played, both by virtue of discoverability and the popularity of D&D, the ways that sponsorship opportunities focus on new releases, as well as those that can afford to participate in that economy. And I also want to note, and we can talk about this more fully in discussion, the ways in which actual play structurally favors GM-led systems. That's not uniform, that's not everybody, but it is overwhelmingly the majority of actual play. But what I also want to note at the very end here is that none of this is inherent to actual play. There are exceptions to all of these, nor is it inevitable, nor is it impossible to change. Our job is to provide visibility to those signifiers of change. Moreover, many of these things, if not all of them, are also true of the hobby and the industry as a whole. if we stop thinking about actual play as the bad new kid who changes and messes up our game, but instead an awkward mirror that's holding up a whole lot of stuff that's already present in the system, what would happen to our understanding of the form? I hope I have left a whole bunch of time for questions from all of my suggestiveness. I have so many thanks that fit beyond this, but these are the victims who had to listen to my process. Thank you all very much.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. So I'm going to ask the audience to put your questions into the Q&A and I'll read them out, but I will start them off with a very easy question that I'm curious about because I know you've done so much research on this topic. Um, uh, so this is about leisure because we often talk about leisure when talking about hobby games and play and stuff like that. And I'm curious if in speaking to the folks in actual play communities, if many of them have ever talked to you about games that they play at home that are not front stage, or is all of the play they do, within encompassed within that sort of actual play moment and kind of subsumed by the work world of actual play.
Yeah, so it's actually so my interview protocol specifically asks people about the difference between their home games and their recorded games. And what's very interesting is that this is generational in many ways. That a lot of people who are have home games that are separate. Brennan will tell you, for example, right, his home game just it doesn't have Rick Perry, right? He's not a miniatures guy, he's a pen and paper guy, but that everything else is quite similar to Worlds Beyond Number. Dimension 20 is constrained in all kinds of ways. What's really interesting to me about many of the younger emergent generation that I speak to is that these are their home games. I had one person talk to me and say, "Oh yeah, I play very differently in home games versus actual play." And I said, "Oh, tell me about your home game. Tell me how it's so different." Well, they hadn't played a home game in 5 years. For them, that was college. That was a completely different set of friends who play in a different kind of play style. So I so there's not an easy kind of comparison to oh, I also play with these people offline and we do things differently in those kinds of ways, which I found really, really interesting. But that's the kind of thing that really complicates our notion of home game is for many people, this was, oh, we're able to have a home game at all because we're recording remotely and we're putting it out and we feel a responsibility to each other and to an audience. So actual play is the home game in interesting ways.
Thank you for that answer. Evan, I'll get you in a second, but Austin got in there first with a question. And Austin's question is, this is stunning. Thank you for your work. I have two questions, so feel to answer just one. But first is you mentioned that some of your home games went to stream and stayed that way, but sounds like one of them went back to only being a non-streamed home game. Did you notice any substantive shift in the game after this shift online? And two, you ended by saying actually play structures favors GM-led systems. Can you say more about what these structures are, etc.?
Okay. Okay. Step one, step two. Okay. So first of all, my home games that are online are not recorded. Just to be very clear, um, and that is in part because uh, they're online because they are geographically remote, right? I play with groups of friends who are academics who are all over the place. My home game here in Auburn, Oops All Historians, came back together as soon as it was reasonably safe for us to do so. Um, Aside from one player who had moved out of state. And so we have actually officially a hybrid game where we have a little webcam. And it is, as with many things that are hybrid, it's real sucky to be the hybrid part of that home game. But and it is different when we play online. Um, Versus because sometimes because we are still COVID cautious, if someone's not feeling well, or for a variety of reasons, we will go back online. So this is all to say that I have not noticed a lot of difference in my own practice in the different selves that I have encountered in these different structures. I am an N of one, but there you go. Um, Remind me of the second question, Aaron. That was
The
about.
second question is that you ended by saying actual play structures
Oh,
favors GM-led systems. Can you
yeah.
say more about what these structures are?
Thank you for the, yeah, this is the director's cut part of the talk. So in preparation for this talk, I like texted everybody I knew and was like, hey, do you have more to say that I can quote you on the record about home games versus your recorded games? And Abria Iyengar noted the ways in which for uh, there's an extra Worlds Beyond number behind a Patreon paywall, Slam Daniel one shot, which is played in a system that is originally intended to be GM-less, but because they had made a Patreon goal that Abria was running the game, and because she wanted to have some control over the chaos, she actually retrofitted it to have a game master. And Brennan similarly was like, I can't imagine Dimension 20's workflow before play functioning with a GM-less system, because then you'd have so much emergent stuff. How would you get the art department 6 months ahead of time or 3 months or whatever to build out the necessary sets? It would have to be, or now they have projections, things like that. So logistical things. Interestingly, Matt Mercer was the one who was like, my players might be uncomfortable with it at first, but I think they could pull it off. I think we could do it, which I think is very interesting. But yeah, the general consensus is the GM is serving an actual play so often as like the showrunner and the reason that the actual play exists, that's the reason why there aren't as many GM-less games, aside from things like Party of One or the like, where you can get away with it, or One Shot or things like that.
Thanks, Em. I'm going to now invite Evan to come back up to ask his question live.
I'm here. My question is that people frequently link my own community, the LARP community, to community theater. Is this also the case with actual play? Do people often make the community theater comparison? And how does that framework help us or not in understanding actual play?
So the community theater kind of analogy is one that's pretty prevalent. And it breaks down pretty quickly when you think about how will actual play sustain itself. In part because you have to have a community to support the theater. And in community theater, that is geolocated. That works really well for small language groups. There aren't that many Ukrainian language actual play troops, for example. Um, it breaks down when you're talking about the fact that actual play is dominated by a very small slice of a very specific community. Actual play is overwhelmingly queer, overwhelmingly neurodivergent, overwhelmingly North American, overwhelmingly English speaking. That's not the only communities, but when you're talking about how to fund that many productions from a very small community, you face challenges. There's also not the kind of regional to what is Broadway kind of analogy, which I think is also something that people think about. It's also a challenge of how do we think about unionization, which I think is potentially coming for actual play.
All right, moving on to the next question. Adriana Burton asks, on your big list of things that might or might not matter, breaks. Brendan asking for a bio break on the first Downfall episode created such a moment since some of the players were confused and the show never included that visible time skip except for the mid-show break. I'd love to hear how you think about the differences in these types of choices, even between legacy actual plays affecting the medium, or just thoughts on break, rest, disability, and more.
No, I think that's really interesting. In fact, I actually I texted Brennan at that moment, and he was like, "They couldn't have edited that out." And I was like, "Critical Role doesn't edit anything out officially. I mean, and as far as I know, they don't for their main campaign. That's the selling point. They now do a tighter edit for their abridged version." Um, but to signify the body's needs is such a Brennan brand, right? He is known to need almonds, which I ate right before I came on camera, and I was like, oh, I'm having a Brennan moment. Um, and so the kind of the fragility of the body at play is something that's really fascinating to me, especially in the ways that Dimension 20 does highlight it a lot of times, right? It's that it's late at night, or that it's been a long recording day, or those kinds of things. The exigencies of the body come up. Um, they can come up more. What I want to kind of draw an interesting parallel between the ways in which people talk about that the body's needs in those ways, and the ways in which safety tools, to the extent that they are used in actual play, are elided from view for safety purposes. When I ask about how safety tools are used in some folks' actual plays, to the extent that they're used, they're designed to be not visible to the audience, so that the audience doesn't know who is being triggered, which I think is a really interesting kind of aspect of what is elided, how it conforms to bodily and mental safety in those kinds of ways. It's still something I'm turning over. The last 2 months have made me think that live streamed actual play is, for that reason, some of the riskiest actual play that is done, because in any other form, something can be edited out and elided, but instead it has to go sub rosa in live stream.
Excellent. Thanks for the answer, Em. Now, Dave Murphy. Hi, Dave. It's been a while. Um, Asks, have you thought about engagement and how different definitions of engagement are related to the notion of actual play?
Oh, that's super interesting. Um, I haven't thought about it as much as I want to and should. I have a kind of vacillating like I came to this, and much of my scholarship to date has been about readers and audiences. And what's been tricky about the trajectory of my own work in actual play specifically is, as I said before the recording started, I'm actually not allowed in certain fan spaces because of my proximity to actual play creators. And so certain kinds of metrics of engagement and thinking about the process of engagement are actually far more available to my colleagues who are doing that work um, from other positionalities than it is to me.
Great. Moving on, David Hall asks, do you see the conversation that's emerged around actual play shows an expansion of the early culture of tabletop RPG play that was emphatically private, resistant to any observation, totally closed doors to outsiders, including researchers? I'd initially thought that this about this as part of the background for where the comfort with and success of a kind of tabletop aesthetic comes from. But it's interesting to think about the meta conversation around things like the Mercer effect as a backlash from this sense of tabletop RPG play as importantly private. And I'm just going to flag to the room, if you have a question or so left, I think we have time for maybe one, very possibly two more after this. But um,
Yeah, I'll try to keep it tight in order to potentially answer more questions. Um, I think we have understanding from things like pro wrestling of kayfabe, which I think informs a lot of audience response to actual play. We've got overlapping audiences here. So I think that while there is a draw to authenticity, there's also the sense that that authenticity might itself be a performance, or is a performance, et cetera, et cetera. So it's murky urky, I think, is the answer.
Murky Urky. Um,
Oh God, this is being recorded.
the wonderful Maria Alberto asks, would love to hear more of your thoughts on fans and their positionalities, given how intertwined actual play is with its fans.
Yeah, so at Big Bad Con last year, I found myself standing in the middle of the atrium. I also said this before the recording, and I said to Jeff Stormer of Party of One, "Are there any fans, or are there only content creators?" And that I'm. What's really fascinating to me, and again, this is something I can't study, but you can, you being Maria or anybody, um, that that there's different kinds of fan expressions, some of which have a pathway, like fan artists and the like, into a professional and personal relationship with actual play productions, and fan works like fan fiction that very much do not. And I think that that kind of nexus of different kinds of relationality is very interesting. Also, the ways in which fans actively seek privacy for some activities, either rhetorically, like using particular kinds of terms on social media, or coming into private discords, which I think is really interesting. And it's something that surprises actual play creators when I talk to them about it. The idea that their fans don't actually always want to be perceived.
Awesome. And we have time, I think, for one more if anybody wants to type it in very briefly.
Austin's got a question about 20-sided tavern. Yeah, a contentious
Wait,
site.
what is the question?
Oh, where does something like 20-sided tavern, which is an off-Broadway D&D show, now about to make a national tour, fit into the AP matrix? Is the in-person performance of a TTRPG the same as an actual play? Actual play creators divide very strongly. Many creators who have seen the show, I have not yet, but will be, although disclosure, I've gotten swag from them. But many creators say it is not actual play, because it is very railroaded, very scripted. Nothing will change in the narrative of that performance, and so there's something so script. It is indeed scripted in ways that even a LARP isn't scripted to this extent. So I would tend to think about it as, is it even play at all? It's, it's not. I don't think we'd even count it as immersive theater. It's D&D inspired.
Awesome. Well, it's been such an honor to have this conversation with you. Really appreciate all the insight and expertise and knowledge that you've shared around actual play with us. I encourage you to hop into the Discord after this, as it's been like a non-stop feed of ideas since you began your presentation. And I'm sure there's many, many people who will be looking to continue the conversation with you there. And for everybody else, I encourage you to stick around because our next panel is on emotional design in games. It looks fantastic. There's some rock star designers coming to talk about their work. We
Way
really just
cooler
can't
than
wait
me.
to have you there at the panel. So we'll see you in 30 minutes and stay analog.
Oh my gosh.